On a foggy morning in 2012, Olivia Tate stood at the edge of Loch Ness, her sample collection kit in hand, droplets of condensation forming on her glasses. She wasn't there to hunt monsters. She was collecting environmental DNA, fragments of genetic material shed by organisms into their surroundings. The evolutionary biologist had expected to find traces of pike, eels, maybe some rare highland fish species. What she didn't expect was to discover genetic material that, according to every evolutionary model and historical record, simply shouldn't exist in Scotland. I remember staring at the sequencing results and thinking there must be contamination, she later told the scientific journal Nature. I ran the analysis 7 more times. The results never changed. The DNA sequences showed markers that belonged to no known Scottish species. More baffling still, they appeared to be from organisms that had never been documented anywhere in Northern Europe. Some sequences suggested species thought to have gone extinct 15,000 years ago. Others matched nothing in any global genetic database. What Olivia had stumbled upon would trigger one of the most profound scientific mysteries of the 21st century. A genetic anomaly that would challenge our understanding of migration patterns, evolutionary biology, and even human history in the Scottish Highlands. The implications were so extraordinary that 3 major universities initially refused to publish her findings, fearing damage to their reputations. But the DNA was there, and it shouldn't exist. The story of Scotland's impossible genetics begins not with Olivia's discovery but centuries earlier. In 1773, when famed lexicographer Samuel Johnson toured the Hebrides, he noted something peculiar about the flora he observed. "There are plants here," he wrote, "which I have not observed elsewhere, and which have properties unknown to English botanists." Johnson, no trained naturalist, dismissed these observations as curiosities. But he had unknowingly documented the first historical reference to Scotland's genetic anomaly. Fast forward to 1954, when botanist Dr. Oscar Thompson was conducting field research in Glen Affric, one of Scotland's most ancient Caledonian pine forests. Thompson discovered a strain of Scots pine with unusual resin composition and growth patterns that defied explanation. He published his findings in a small academic journal, noting that the trees contained genetic expressions inconsistent with their latitude and climate. His work was largely forgotten, filed away as an interesting but minor botanical curiosity. The modern chapter of the story begins properly in 2009, when the Scottish Wildlife Trust launched an initiative to catalog biodiversity across the Highlands using emerging DNA sampling techniques. This project, modest in scope, aimed to establish conservation baselines and track endangered species. Vincent Turner, a graduate student working on the project, noticed odd discrepancies in some samples but lacked the advanced sequencing technology to identify them fully. "We knew something was off," Turner recalled in a 2019 interview, "but the technology just wasn't there yet to tell us exactly what we were looking at." That changed with the advent of environmental DNA, EDNA, analysis, a revolutionary technique allowing scientists to detect genetic material left behind in soil, water, or air. Organisms constantly shed cells containing DNA through skin, excretion, reproduction, creating a genetic footprint in their environment. By 2012, when Olivia Tate began her systematic sampling of Scottish lochs, the technology had advanced enough to capture and identify these genetic fragments with unprecedented precision. Environmental DNA was changing ecology forever, explained Dr. Ryan Miller, geneticist at Edinburgh University. Suddenly, you could take a liter of water from a loch, run it through filters, sequence what you found, and build a complete picture of every organism that had been there recently. Fish, amphibians, plants, microorganisms without ever seeing them. The Scottish Highlands presented a perfect natural laboratory. Its isolated valleys, ancient forests, and deep, cold lochs had remained relatively unchanged for millennia. If there were places where unusual genetic material might persist undisturbed, the remote corners of Scotland were prime candidates. What no one anticipated was just how unusual those genetics would be. When Olivia's preliminary findings began circulating among a small group of trusted colleagues in late 2012, the reactions ranged from skepticism to outright dismissal. The data showed genetic sequences from plant species normally found in southern Europe and North Africa, animal DNA resembling species native to the Caucasus Mountains, microbial signatures matching extremophiles from Antarctic environments. Most puzzling of all were sequences bearing strong similarities to species thought to have gone extinct after the last ice age, including markers resembling Pleistocene mammals that had never been documented in the British Isles. The first question everyone asked was whether my samples had been contaminated, Olivia said. It was the rational explanation, but we had followed every protocol meticulously. To rule out contamination, Olivia assembled a team including Owen Talbot, a forensic geneticist from Glasgow University, and Victoria Thorne, a paleobiologist specializing in ancient DNA. In January 2013, they conducted new samplings across 27 sites in the Highlands, using sterile techniques that would have satisfied a crime scene investigation. The results were identical to Olivia's original findings. The impossible DNA was real. That's when we knew we were dealing with something profound, Owen later wrote in the Proceedings of the Royal Society. Not an error, not contamination, but a genuine scientific anomaly demanding explanation. The team faced a fundamental question. How could genetic material from species that never lived in Scotland be present in its soil and waters? The answer would lead them down a rabbit hole of scientific inquiry, touching on everything from ancient human migrations to climate shifts to the very mechanisms of genetic transfer between species. Their investigation would also raise an even more provocative question. What if our understanding of Scotland's biological history was fundamentally incomplete? In the spring of 2013, the research team expanded their sampling to cover every region of Scotland, from the Outer Hebrides to the borders. They collected over 1,200 soil samples, 800 water samples, and tissue samples from 340 plant species. They analyzed pollen from peat bogs dating back thousands of years and examined preserved specimens from natural history collections. The pattern remained consistent. Scattered throughout Scotland's ecosystem were genetic signatures that had no business being there. We were mapping genetic ghosts, Victoria Thorne explained. DNA from organisms that, according to everything we know about natural history, never existed in these latitudes. The anomalous genetic material wasn't randomly distributed. It appeared in concentrated pockets, often around ancient human settlement sites, places that had been continuously inhabited since the Neolithic period. This pattern hinted at a possible connection to human activity, but of a kind unprecedented in the archaeological record. By the summer of 2013, the research had attracted attention from specialists across disciplines. Archaeologists, geologists, and anthropologists joined the investigation, each bringing different perspectives to the mystery. The Scottish government, recognizing the potential significance, provided emergency funding for a comprehensive research program. Dr. Owen Talbot established a specialized laboratory at Glasgow University dedicated solely to analyzing the anomalous DNA. His team developed new protocols to distinguish between modern contamination and genuine ancient signatures. Using techniques adapted from forensics, they could determine whether genetic material had been in the environment for decades, centuries, or millennia. The results were startling. Some of these genetic signatures have been present in Scotland for at least 6,000 years, Talbot announced at a closed scientific conference in October 2013. They didn't arrive recently. They've been here longer than Stonehenge. This timeline coincided with a critical period in Scotland's human history, the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural communities during the Neolithic Revolution. Around 4000 BCE, farming technologies spread northward through Europe, transforming landscapes and human relationships with the natural world. The question became, could these early agricultural practices somehow explain the genetic anomalies? To answer this, the team needed to look beyond genetics into archaeology and anthropology. They began examining Neolithic settlement sites with fresh eyes, looking for evidence of unusual agricultural or cultural practices. Dr. Valerie Thornton, an archaeobotanist from Aberdeen University, led excavations at Skara Brae in Orkney, one of Europe's best-preserved Neolithic villages, inhabited from approximately 3180 BCE to 2500 BCE. Her team used advanced chemical analysis techniques to examine residues in pottery and soil from ancient middens, refuse heaps. We found pollen and plant residues that didn't match any species native to Scotland, Thornton reported in early 2014. Some resembled cultivars from the Mediterranean and Middle East. Others we couldn't identify at all. Similar findings emerged from excavations at Neolithic sites across Scotland, from Callanize in the Outer Hebrides to Maeshowe in Orkney. The evidence suggested that Scotland's earliest farmers had been cultivating plants that shouldn't have been able to survive in the Scottish climate. These weren't just imports, explained Dr. Omar Travers, paleoethnobotanist at St. Andrews University. The residues showed these plants were growing here, reproducing here. Somehow, Neolithic farmers had adapted Mediterranean and Middle Eastern crops to thrive in Scotland's harsh conditions. But how was this possible? Modern agricultural science struggled to grow these same species in Scotland even with greenhouses and genetic modifications. How had Neolithic farmers succeeded where modern technology failed? The mystery deepened when the team expanded their analysis to ancient human remains. With special permission and following strict ethical protocols, they extracted DNA from Neolithic burial sites. The results added another layer to the puzzle. The human genomic data showed something remarkable, said Dr. Victoria Thorne. Neolithic Scots carried genetic markers typically associated with populations from the Caucasus and Anatolia, far more than could be explained by the known migration patterns of early farmers. This suggested that Scotland had experienced waves of migration more diverse and complex than previously understood. But it still didn't explain how these migrants had managed to bring with them plants and animals that shouldn't have survived the journey, let alone thrived in their new environment. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction: epigenetics. In December 2014, Dr. Olivia Tate collaborated with epigeneticist Dr. Ursula Vance to examine not just the DNA sequences themselves, but the methylation patterns that control gene expression. These patterns can be modified during an organism's lifetime in response to environmental conditions, and some of these modifications can be passed to offspring. We found evidence of extensive epigenetic modifications in the anomalous plant DNA, Dr. Vance explained. These modifications effectively rewrote the rulebook for how these plants responded to temperature, daylight hours, and soil conditions. In other words, the Neolithic migrants hadn't just brought new species to Scotland, they had brought species that had been epigenetically modified to survive in Scotland's environment. This wasn't genetic engineering as we understand it today, Olivia Tate clarified. It was more like accelerated adaptation through careful selection and cultivation practices maintained over many generations. The implications were profound. Neolithic farmers had possessed sophisticated understanding of plant breeding and adaptation that went far beyond the primitive agriculture historians had attributed to them. But there was still a problem with this theory. Even with epigenetic modifications, many of the plant species identified in the DNA samples required specific soil microbiomes to thrive, symbiotic relationships with fungi and bacteria that couldn't have naturally occurred in Scottish soil. This led to the next major question. Had the Neolithic migrants somehow transported entire ecological systems to Scotland? The research team shifted focus to examining soil microbiomes around ancient settlement sites. Using both modern samples and preserved soil from archaeological contexts, they reconstructed the microbial communities that had existed in different time periods. By early 2015, they had their answer. The soil around Neolithic settlements contained microbial DNA from species native to the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and even Central Asia. These microbes had persisted in isolated pockets for thousands of years, creating microenvironments where non-native plants could flourish. They didn't just bring seeds, said microbiologist Dr. Omar Thompson. They brought the soil, the microbes, the entire living system that these plants depended on. It was a deliberate transplantation of ecosystems. This discovery revolutionized understanding of Neolithic agricultural practices. Rather than simple farmers, these early settlers appeared to have been sophisticated bioengineers with a deep practical knowledge of plant-soil relationships, knowledge that would not be rediscovered by modern science until the 20th century. But if this explained the plant DNA, what about the animal genetics? The samples had revealed genetic material from species like the Caucasian wild goat, the Near Eastern wild ass, and even fragments resembling extinct Pleistocene mammals. Dr. Victoria Thorne proposed a radical hypothesis. What if they brought animals too? Not just domesticated livestock, but species we've never associated with Neolithic migration. Animals that may have gone extinct in Scotland but whose DNA persisted in the environment. To test this theory, the team needed to find physical evidence. Bones, teeth, anything that might contain intact DNA from these mysterious animals. They returned to museum collections, re-examining unidentified bone fragments from old excavations using new genetic techniques. In the summer of 2015, they found their smoking gun. A bone fragment excavated from a Neolithic settlement at Jarlshof in Shetland in the 1930s, previously identified simply as large mammal, yielded DNA matching a species of wild ass native to Mesopotamia, a species never before documented in Britain. This wasn't a traded item, Owen Talbot emphasized. The bone showed signs of having grown under local conditions. This animal lived and died in Scotland. Similar discoveries followed. A tooth from a cave in Assynt matched the genetic profile of a Caucasian ibex. Horn fragments from a settlement in Orkney came from a species of gazelle native to the Middle East. These findings shattered conventional understanding of Neolithic animal husbandry and trade networks. The early settlers hadn't just brought the familiar domesticates, sheep, goats, cattle, but a diverse menagerie of animals from their homelands, animals that had subsequently gone extinct in Scotland but left their genetic legacy in the soil. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. In September 2015, a peat bog in the Cairngorms yielded preserved tissue containing DNA sequences that matched no known species, living or extinct. The closest matches were to Pleistocene mammals, but with significant differences that suggested an unknown evolutionary branch. We believe we've discovered evidence of a mammal species that evolved in isolation in Scotland and went extinct before it could be documented by modern science, announced Dr. Victoria Thorne. A species that may have survived the Pleistocene extinction only to disappear before recorded history. This announcement sent shockwaves through the scientific community. If true, it meant that Scotland had been home to unique large mammals that had evaded scientific discovery, a nearly unthinkable scenario in a region as well-studied as Western Europe. Critics were quick to attack the findings. Some suggested the DNA came from known species but had degraded in ways that made it unrecognizable. Others maintained that contamination remained the most likely explanation despite all precautions. The debate might have remained academic except for what happened next. In December 2015, a shepherd in a remote area of Sutherland discovered unusual bone fragments exposed by erosion after heavy storms. The bones were unlike anything he had seen before. Not deer, not cattle, not any familiar Highland animal. Experts from the National Museum of Scotland collected the remains and submitted samples for DNA analysis. The results matched the mysterious sequences from the peat bog. Here was physical confirmation of an unknown species that had once roamed Scotland. Reconstruction of the partial skeleton suggested a medium-sized ungulate, somewhat resembling a mountain goat but with distinctive adaptations for Scotland's terrain and climate. Carbon dating placed the remains at approximately 3,800 years old, the early Bronze Age, and much more recent than anyone had expected. This animal was alive when the pyramids were being built, noted Owen Talbot. Not some distant Pleistocene relic, but a contemporary of ancient Egyptian civilization, and no one knew it existed until now. The researchers named the species Capreolus caledoniensis, the Caledonian roe. Analysis of its teeth and bone structure suggested it was a browser, feeding on highland vegetation. Isotope analysis indicated it had evolved in isolation for at least 15,000 years, adapting to Scotland's post-glacial environment. The question became, had this animal evolved naturally in Scotland's isolation, or was its presence somehow connected to the mysterious Neolithic migrations? The team revisited their environmental DNA samples, specifically looking for genetic markers from the newly identified species. They found them, not just in the Highlands but across Scotland, with particularly high concentrations around ancient human settlements. The distribution pattern strongly suggests human influence, said Dr. Olivia Tate. This wasn't just an animal that happened to live near humans. Its presence correlates specifically with Neolithic settlement patterns. This raised an extraordinary possibility. The Neolithic migrants hadn't just brought animals from their homelands. They may have engaged in active breeding programs, creating new hybrid species adapted to Scotland's unique environment. To test this hypothesis, the team conducted detailed genomic analysis of the Caledonian roe remains. The results were unambiguous. Its genome contained markers from multiple Eurasian ungulate species, combined in ways that couldn't have occurred through natural hybridization. This was deliberate crossbreeding, concluded Dr. Owen Talbot. Neolithic people created this animal through selective breeding over many generations. The implications were revolutionary. Conventional archaeology had always portrayed Neolithic farmers as primitive opportunists, making simple improvements to wild species through basic selection. The evidence from Scotland painted a very different picture of sophisticated bioengineers who understood inheritance, adaptation, and ecosystem management at levels not previously attributed to ancient peoples. By early 2016, the research team had assembled enough evidence to publish their findings in full. Their paper, Anthropogenic Biological Engineering in Neolithic Scotland, Evidence from Environmental DNA and Archaeological Sources, appeared in Science in March 2016, triggering what some called the Scottish genetic revolution in archaeological thinking. The paper detailed their comprehensive theory. Between 4500 and 3800 BCE, Scotland had experienced migration not just from continental Europe, but from much further afield, including the Caucasus, Anatolia, and possibly even North Africa. These migrants brought with them not just technologies and cultural practices, but entire ecological packages, plants, animals, microbes, that they had systematically modified over generations to survive in new environments. Upon reaching Scotland, they continued this process of modification, creating hybrids and new varieties specifically adapted to local conditions. The Caledonian roe was just one example of their bioengineering achievements, a productive livestock animal created to thrive in highland conditions. This biological expertise hadn't been lost immediately. It persisted through the Neolithic and into the Bronze Age, with communities maintaining specialized knowledge about plant breeding, animal husbandry, and ecological management. Only around 1500 BCE did this sophisticated biological tradition appear to fade from Scotland, possibly due to climate change, social upheaval, or the arrival of new populations with different technological traditions. The DNA traces discovered by Olivia Tate and her colleagues were the lingering evidence of this lost biological revolution, genetic ghosts in the highland soil. The publication sparked intense debate across multiple scientific fields. Archaeologists had to reconsider fundamental assumptions about Neolithic capabilities and social organization. Geneticists faced new questions about the mechanisms of artificial selection and hybridization in prehistory. Anthropologists reevaluated models of traditional ecological knowledge and its transmission across generations. This discovery forces us to confront our chronocentrism, our bias that ancient peoples must have been less sophisticated than us in their understanding of the natural world, wrote archaeologist Dr. Ursula Vaughan in a commentary accompanying the paper. The findings also opened new avenues for understanding Scotland's distinctive ecological history. The Highlands and Islands had long been recognized as having unusual patterns of biodiversity compared to similar regions at the same latitude. The anthropogenic introduction of modified species and entire microbiomes offered an explanation for these patterns that had eluded earlier researchers. But while the scientific community grappled with the implications, the research team was already moving to the next phase of investigation, understanding the fate of this biological knowledge. If Neolithic Scots had possessed such sophisticated ecological expertise, what had happened to it? Had it disappeared entirely, or had elements persisted in folk traditions and practices? Dr. Valerie Thornton led this aspect of the research, working with historians, folklorists, and ethnobotanists to examine Scottish traditional knowledge about plants, animals, and landscapes. Her team analyzed everything from medieval herbals to 19th century accounts of Highland farming practices, looking for traces of the ancient biological understanding. They found tantalizing clues. Scottish folk medicine included uses for plants that matched their biochemical properties in ways modern science had only recently confirmed. Traditional highland agricultural practices included soil management techniques that optimized microbial communities in ways that science didn't understand until the late 20th century. Gaelic poetry contained detailed phenological knowledge about plant and animal life cycles that aligned with modern ecological understanding. There were persistent echoes of the ancient knowledge, Dr. Thornton concluded. Not the complete system, but fragments preserved in cultural practices and oral traditions, often without their practitioners fully understanding the scientific principles behind them. This raised a profound question about knowledge transmission across millennia. How much ancient wisdom might be encoded in cultural practices around the world, waiting to be recognized by modern science? By mid-2016, the implications of the Scottish genetic anomalies had expanded far beyond archaeology and genetics. Researchers in fields ranging from ethnobotany to climate science were finding applications for the discoveries. One particularly fruitful area emerged at the intersection of archaeology and climate adaptation research. If Neolithic peoples had successfully modified plants and animals to thrive in new climates, their techniques might offer insights for modern challenges of agricultural adaptation to climate change. Dr. Olivia Tate partnered with agricultural scientists to investigate whether any of the genetic modifications identified in ancient plant remains could be reproduced using modern breeding techniques. Their focus was on drought resistance and cold tolerance, traits that would become increasingly valuable in a changing climate. "We're not trying to resurrect extinct species," Dr. Tate emphasized. "We're looking at the specific genetic and epigenetic mechanisms that allowed these plants to adapt, and seeing if those same pathways could be utilized in modern crops." The research yielded promising results. Several of the epigenetic modifications identified in ancient barley samples appeared to confer significant drought resistance without compromising yield, a holy grail for agricultural adaptation. When similar modifications were induced in modern barley varieties, they showed 40% better drought survival with only a 7% reduction in yield under normal conditions. These ancient farmers solved problems we're still struggling with, noted agronomist Dr. Omar Taylor. They didn't have our technology, but they had something perhaps more valuable: multi-generational observation and experimentation. Meanwhile, Owen Talbot's laboratory at Glasgow University continued analyzing the anomalous animal DNA, focusing particularly on the extinct Caledonian roe. Their genomic reconstruction revealed adaptations for efficient digestion of highland vegetation that might have applications for modern livestock breeding. These animals could extract more nutrition from poor-quality forage than any modern sheep or cattle breed, Dr. Talbot explained. They had gut microbiomes specifically engineered, there's no other word for it, to process plants that other ruminants couldn't effectively digest. This finding attracted attention from sustainable agriculture researchers worldwide. If the microbiome compositions could be replicated in modern livestock, it could potentially reduce feed requirements and allow productive grazing on marginal lands currently considered unsuitable for agriculture. The Scottish government recognized the potential economic and environmental benefits of these discoveries. In November 2016, they established the Ancient Adaptations Research Initiative, providing £30 million in funding for projects applying insights from the ancient DNA to modern challenges in agriculture, medicine, and ecology. But as practical applications multiplied, the most profound questions remained historical and anthropological. How had Neolithic people developed such sophisticated biological engineering capabilities? What social structures had supported the multi-generational experiments necessary for such achievements? And why had this knowledge been lost? Dr. Victoria Thorne led a multidisciplinary team investigating these questions. They synthesized evidence from genetics, archaeology, linguistics, and comparative anthropology to construct a model of Neolithic knowledge systems and their transmission. Their conclusions, published in early 2017, presented a radical reinterpretation of Neolithic society. The evidence suggests specialized knowledge castes, Dr. Thorne explained. Not just shamans or priests, but people specifically dedicated to plant and animal breeding, soil management, and ecosystem engineering. These specialists held positions of high status and operated across multiple generations within structured teaching lineages. This model challenged conventional views of Neolithic social organization as relatively simple and egalitarian. Instead, It suggested complex knowledge hierarchies with specialized roles maintained over centuries through formalized teaching relationships, something more akin to medieval guild structures than the loose tribal arrangements typically ascribed to Neolithic communities. Linguistic evidence supported this interpretation. Analysis of surviving Celtic and pre-Celtic language fragments revealed sophisticated technical vocabularies for biological relationships, breeding categories, and ecological connections. These vocabularies suggested conceptual frameworks for understanding inheritance and adaptation that, while expressed differently, paralleled many modern scientific concepts. They didn't have genes or DNA in their vocabulary, noted linguistic anthropologist Dr. Teller, but they had precise terms for inheritance patterns, for beneficial mutations, for hybrid vigor, concepts that Western science wouldn't formalize until Mendel and beyond. The research also offered an explanation for why this knowledge tradition had eventually faded. Around 1500 BCE, Scotland experienced a period of rapid climate deterioration, with colder, wetter conditions becoming established across the region. This coincided with archaeological evidence of population decline, abandonment of settlements, and cultural disruption. The climate shift appears to have broken the knowledge transmission chains, Dr. Thorne proposed. With populations under stress and communities fragmenting, the specialized teaching lineages couldn't be maintained. Once that generational transmission was interrupted, the knowledge couldn't be easily reconstructed. This pattern of sophisticated practical knowledge developed over millennia, then lost during periods of social disruption, offered sobering parallels to contemporary concerns about knowledge resilience in the face of global challenges. We think of scientific knowledge as permanent once discovered, commented science historian Dr. Ursula Vance. But the Scottish case shows how even remarkably advanced practical understanding can be lost when the social structures supporting its transmission break down. By mid-2017, the Scottish genetic anomaly, as it had become known in scientific literature, had transformed from a puzzling discovery to a revolutionary framework for understanding human-environment relationships in prehistory. It had also become a cautionary tale about the fragility of knowledge across generational boundaries. But the story wasn't over. As the original research team continued their investigations, they uncovered evidence suggesting that Scotland wasn't unique. Similar genetic anomalies, though less pronounced, began appearing in environmental DNA samples from other parts of Europe, particularly mountainous regions in the Alps, Pyrenees, and Carpathians. We're seeing the same patterns, reported Dr. Olivia Tate in August 2017. Genetic material that shouldn't be there, showing signs of deliberate modification, concentrated around ancient settlement sites. Scotland's not an exception. It's just where the evidence was best preserved. This expanded the significance of the findings from a regional curiosity to a fundamental reconsideration of Neolithic societies across Europe. If similar biological engineering had been practiced across the continent, it suggested a widespread knowledge tradition that had been almost entirely lost to history. The implications extended beyond Europe as well. Researchers began examining environmental DNA from ancient agricultural centers worldwide, the Fertile Crescent, Yellow River Valley, Mesoamerica, Andean Highlands, looking for similar patterns of anthropogenic genetic modification. Preliminary results, while still uncertain, suggested that sophisticated biological engineering may have been a common feature of early agricultural societies globally, not an isolated development, but a fundamental aspect of how humans adapted to new environments as they spread across the planet. We may need to rewrite not just Scottish history, but human history, Owen Talbot suggested. The boundary between hunter-gatherers and farmers wasn't just about planting seeds instead of gathering them. It may have involved a much more sophisticated understanding of how to reshape ecosystems to human needs. This reinterpretation of early agriculture resonated with indigenous knowledge systems that had long been marginalized by Western science. Many traditional cultures maintained that their ancestors had possessed deep ecological knowledge that included active management and modification of plants, animals, and landscapes, claims often dismissed as mythology by conventional archaeology. The Scottish evidence forces us to take these traditional knowledge claims more seriously, acknowledged archaeologist Dr. Ursula Vincent. If Neolithic Europeans were capable of this level of biological engineering, we should reconsider our dismissal of similar claims from indigenous knowledge systems worldwide. By late 2017, the research had attracted attention far beyond academic circles. Media coverage highlighted both the historical revelations and the potential practical applications for modern challenges like climate adaptation and sustainable agriculture. The Scottish government capitalized on the international interest, establishing the Caledonian Bioadaptation Centre in Inverness, a research institute dedicated to studying the ancient techniques and applying them to contemporary problems. With partnerships spanning universities, agricultural organizations, and pharmaceutical companies, the center became a global hub for bioinnovation inspired by ancient practices. "We've come full circle," remarked Dr. Olivia Tate at the center's opening ceremony. 6,000 years ago, Scotland was a living laboratory for biological adaptation. Today, it's becoming that again, not despite its ancient history, but because of it. But as the practical applications multiplied, the deepest significance of the Scottish genetic anomalies remained philosophical. They challenged fundamental assumptions about progress, knowledge, and the relationship between ancient and modern understanding of the natural world. "We've been telling ourselves a story about human history as a steady progression from ignorance to knowledge," reflected Dr. Victoria Thorne. The Scottish evidence suggests a much more complex pattern of sophisticated knowledge systems developing, flourishing, then disappearing, with only fragments surviving in cultural memory. This perspective offered both humbling and hopeful insights for contemporary challenges. It humbled modern science by revealing that ancient peoples had developed practical solutions to problems we still struggle with. But it also offered hope by suggesting that humans have repeatedly shown remarkable ingenuity in adapting to environmental challenges, a capacity we urgently need in the face of contemporary climate change. As 2018 began, the research team published a comprehensive synthesis of their 5 years of investigation. Titled The Lost Biological Revolution: Anthropogenic Adaptation in Neolithic Scotland and Beyond, the 400-page volume detailed the complete evidence for ancient biological engineering and its implications across multiple disciplines. The book concluded with a passage that encapsulated the philosophical significance of their discoveries. "The DNA hidden in Scotland's soil tells a story not just about our past, but about our future. It reveals that our ancestors were not primitive precursors to modern achievement, but sophisticated engineers of their biological world who developed solutions we are only beginning to rediscover." Their story reminds us that knowledge is not a steady accumulation but a fragile inheritance, easily lost in times of disruption. Yet it also shows the remarkable human capacity for adaptation, for reshaping ourselves and our environment to survive and thrive in changing conditions. As we face our own environmental challenges, perhaps the most important lesson from Scotland's impossible DNA is that we have overcome such challenges before, through patience, observation, and collaborative wisdom sustained across generations. The Scottish genetic anomalies had begun as a scientific mystery, DNA that shouldn't exist in a landscape where it had no business being found. They ended by transforming our understanding not just of Scotland's past, but of humanity's relationship with the natural world across millennia. What started with Olivia Tate's foggy morning at Loch Ness concluded with a profound reconsideration of human capability and the cycles of knowledge through which we have repeatedly adapted to a changing world. Hidden DNA revealing not just forgotten species, but forgotten wisdom that might help us face the challenges of our uncertain future.